most people don't think about politics in terms of problem solving. They think about politics in terms of personal identity. If you live in England, you are a conservative or you are a liberal. That's how people think about and talk about their politics. And that's what politics means to them. It's not the solution to any particular kind of problem. If you live in England, do you think that prisons should be operated by private corporations for a profit? Or do you think they should be run exclusively by the state on taxpayers' dollars on a nonprofit basis? Do you have some other perspective? Do you think they should be run by the church or by charities? There are other possible perspectives. Do you begin or end with a kind of pragmatic concern about how to make the best out of your prison system? No. I mean, almost nobody thinks about and lives with politics in this way. People wake up and eat their breakfast and go to sleep after dinner as a conservative or as a liberal, as a socialist or as a capitalist. That's how they chew their food. That's how they dream in their sleep. That's how they live with their political identity. The political identity they adopt is something they feel beholden to. It's something they have to live up to. It's an expectation they impose on themselves. It starts to define what it means to be a good person. All right? We chase after that idea once we've sort of set it up as an idol in our own minds. And then we don't question in an open-ended, pragmatic way. Oh, well, take a look at the worst prisons that are run by the government. They're socialist. They're perfectly socialist. And now take a look at the best prisons run by the private sector, run by private corporations. Oh, gee, it looks like we have some examples here where private companies are doing a better job running a prison than a socialist government services. I would be the first to admit, by the way, that's disturbing to me. I'm not some rabid free market pro-capitalist person. I'm not. And on an ethical level, I can't help but feel there's something evil about one person trying to make as much money as possible out of keeping another person in a cage, where this person, it's not your customer, it's not your client, it's a prisoner that's been handed to you by the state, and your job is to make this as profitable as possible for your shareholders, to have the greatest return on investment, keeping this human being in a cage, maybe feeding them as little as possible or whatever things you can. It's disturbing. It's shocking. And yet, if you're willing to learn from real world experience, there's a reason why so many Western first world countries, including England, including the United Kingdom, engaged in an experimental basis on trying to bring the private sector in to run prisons in part and in whole, of involving more and more private for-profit companies in doing that, right? What's the best way to run a train system? What's the best way to run a hospital system? What's the best way to run the telecom system to provide telephones and internet access to people? If you wake up and go to sleep and live your whole life with this identity of being a socialist, right? You're never going to, in an open-minded, pragmatic way, question and examine the often contradictory and often disturbing evidence of why and how it is that the real world works the way it does, from sector to sector, from case to case, from instance to instance. And look, guys, I was just clicking around YouTube. Every so often I think about changing the genre I'm trapped in a little bit. A lot of my time lately is reading books, big, heavy, awful, imposing books like this. And what's going on in hashtag Booktube? Booktube is the genre of people who devote their lives to reading and reviewing books. And what I saw, almost at random, how YouTube works. It shows you some information you're not exactly searching for, but it's also not exactly at random. There's this controversy within Booktube about who is a real reader and who is a fake reader. People calling each other a fake reader, right? I can understand why. Once you adopt this identity, once you decide, I'm a booktuber. So I'm gonna read this book this week, and on schedule I'm gonna upload a book review. And the next week it's gonna be this book. You don't want to let your fans down. You don't want to let yourself down. You have a sense of your own ego invested in this project, and maybe you end up just reading the introduction and the conclusion. Maybe your book review isn't really reflecting a familiarity or depth of knowledge of the whole text. Maybe you really didn't put as much time into it as you should. And maybe your channel is successful because you're handsome or charming, or you're a good-looking woman who wears a tight sweater while you're doing the book reviews. And other people get jealous, and other people have read the whole book, and they start denouncing you as a fake reader. So anything can get appropriated in this way into your own sense of pride and ego and identity, right? It's like being a reader, being a book reviewer, right? Of course, people in this way become attached to the notion of being a socialist or of being pro-capitalist. And then that sense of personal commitment comes first and foremost before any pragmatic real-world sense of what these terms mean politically or economically, right? There was another YouTuber who made a couple of really stupid videos criticizing socialism. And whenever I see these things, I am myself the world's harshest critic of socialism. I was the world's harshest critic of Bernie Sanders, and I actually did read his book. I uploaded some detailed criticism of Bernie Sanders and his campaign for president. All right, I am a very harsh critic of socialism. If I watch anyone else criticizing socialism, I feel totally alienated from them. I feel like we have nothing in common. I feel like we're not even living on the same planet, to be honest with you. I'm a critic of capitalism. Not socialist, not communist. When I criticize capitalism, if I then turn and look at the other people who are engaging in critique of capitalism, of course, those people are communists. Those people are socialists. And I feel like we are not even living on the same planet. I feel like they're not in touch with the same reality that I'm trying to examine. I saw this other YouTuber criticizing socialism, and one of the main points he relies on or falls back on again and again is this. He complains that in 2021, different people are using different definitions of socialism, which is true. The Bernie Sanders definition of socialism would not be recognized as socialism in Europe. Many socialists would not recognize Bernie Sanders as socialist. So it's true. There is more than one. It's a contentious term. And then he goes on to complain, if you ever try to confront or criticize socialists, whatever critique you offer, they're going to wriggle out of by claiming, oh, well, that's not really socialism. Implicitly or explicitly, that's not really what they meant. And then he goes on to say, understandably, but I think he's quite wrong here, he goes on to say, well, the problem is these people haven't actually read Karl Marx. These people haven't actually read the definitive tomes that establish what socialism is. Like, they're Marxists in name only, but they're fake readers. You're a fake Marxist. They call themselves Marxists, but they haven't really read Marx. They call themselves socialists, but they haven't actually read socialism. So that's not my perspective on that. I think he's 180 degrees wrong. Brief digression. I had an interview with a 24-year-old woman on this channel more than 1 year ago, about a year and a half ago today. She was 24 years old. At that time, she was a die-hard, card-carrying communist. She was a member of a communist party. She supported communism, and I debated with her. I was basically trying to convince her to give up communism on camera, live, for the entertainment of random people on the internet, right? Now, if you just watch that video, you might think I made no impact on her at all. You'd be dead wrong. In that conversation, it had huge impact on her. While she was on camera with me, she didn't renounce or give up on communism. But obviously, I had kind of cracked the shell, and doubts started to seep in. And within just the weeks immediately following that conversation we had, she sat and she watched more and more of the videos on my channel where I'm talking about the history of communism, the economics of socialism and capitalism, what these things really mean. And within just a few months, she had completely renounced communism. She had ceased to be a communist. Okay? In that discussion, in that debate, there's something I didn't get to say right toward the end. Toward the end, I'm asking her, well, look, how is it that you think you know what communism means? Now, we could say this in parallel about socialism. Where did you get your idea, your definition of communism. Where does that come from? Now, there are a bunch of distractions. There are other people trying to interrupt the debate. It goes where it goes, right? But the answer she gives, I think, is perfectly sincere. She says she read Karl Marx. She says she read Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I think she also mentions one book by Stalin, but she mentions some of these big authors, the history of communism, history of socialism. She says she feels she knows what communism is because those are the books she's read. And what I wanted to say to her, and what I want to say to you now is, how would you feel if you met a 24-year-old person today in 2021? They tell you they're a Nazi. And you ask them, well, how do you know what happened during the Nazi period? How do you know about the history of the Nazi Party? How do you know what Nazism really is and what this really means? And they tell you that they've read Adolf Hitler. That what they've read, they've only read propaganda written by and for that extreme political movement. All right? What I see as the problem with socialists, what I see as the problem with communists, is not that they're unaware of Karl Marx. It's not that they haven't read books from within the canon that define socialism. It's that they've only read those books, right? They have read, the equivalent of Adolf Hitler for their political movement. And what they haven't read is the narrative of what really went on at the gas chambers. It's the equivalent, in terms of the critiques. They haven't read about what went wrong. Very often, they know the abstract meaning of terms like class war. And I've tried this many times. Sit down and say, do you know what class war really means? Have you ever read first-person perspective descriptions of what it was like during the Russian Revolution when they went from door to door and they beat and robbed and raped and murdered people? When women were raped in front of their own children, when women's husbands were killed so that the women could be raped. There was also ethnic cleansing. There was persecution, especially of Jews. Anti-Semitism was a very interesting part of what happened in the Russian Revolution. Have you looked at the human face? Have you looked at the political reality and practice of what class war means? I had a vivid account in one of the essays I wrote where the communists show up at a mining camp and they decide they're going to kill the privileged class within this mining camp. It's ridiculous. It was a modern mining setup. It's not the case that there were slaves and slave owners or something. And they try to divide the mine workers amongst themselves and say, okay, who can we recruit into our ranks to be communist extremists and carry on with the looting and pillaging and raping and murdering, which they do. There's a lot of rape in that particular historical, that chapter of history. And who are the people in this mine that we can single out to be persecuted, to be tortured, to have their belongings stolen, and ultimately to be killed in public show trials or otherwise? The reality of what class war means. Most people become committed to socialism just as a series of lines up on a chalkboard, right? Very, very abstract ideas without being informed by history written from any perspective, but certainly without being informed by history written from an anti-socialist perspective, a critique of socialist perspective. And I would be the first one to admit, as I've just said, the vast majority of people who are critics of socialism, the vast majority of people who are anti-socialist, I find deeply embarrassing. I find impossible to listen to. I feel like they're not living on the same planet that I'm on. So it's hard for me to blame socialists for not knowing this stuff. Now, how do people become socialists? They will have probably heard an argument like this in university, or maybe even in high school, or maybe while they were still in primary school. Somebody somewhere stood up in front of a chalkboard and said, hey, this is social inequality. Here are a couple lines. You can live in a society where there are a few billionaires, there are a few hundred millionaires, and there are huge numbers of people living in poverty. Is that the kind of society you want? Oh, and here's socialism. Equality. No millionaires, no billionaires, no poor people. Which one sounds better to you? Which one are you going to choose? Obviously, if you approached this equation with just some real-world mud and blood knowledge of what class war meant, of what really happened in the Russian Revolution, of what happened when they reorganized the farms and reorganized the factories in order to achieve so-called equality, what happened pragmatically and managerially when people took this simple equation on the chalkboard and put it into practice, right? It was bad for everyone. It was bad for the farmers. It was bad for the factory workers. It wasn't just bad for the people who got massacred. The implementation of socialism in Russia, in China, in Cambodia. We could go on with more examples of this kind, right? But we're given this abstract idol up on a chalkboard and told to make our choice. It's an incredibly effective form of propaganda. And most people go on to live their whole lives with commitment to this completely abstract ideology. Right? And then they will force the facts to fit that ideology because they feel it's part of their personal identity, because they feel that any morally good person would support socialism. And during the last 4 years, by the way, you've seen the other side of that equation under Donald Trump. You've seen that there are millions of people who, from the other side of the aisle, they feel all they need to do to discredit you, all they need to do to prove that you're a crackpot, is prove that you're a socialist. That as soon as your name or your policy or your reform to healthcare, as soon as that can be identified as socialist, you're discredited because socialism is this terrible, immoral philosophy, right? Which indeed history has proven to be a great failure. So, these two tendencies in 2021, I feel they're both gaining impetus. I think they're both gaining impetus in opposite directions. And I think they're both well informed. I think all the people involved are reading books, but tragically they're reading the wrong books. They're digging themselves in deeper and deeper to a knowledge that is narrow and blinds them more than it informs them, even to the meaning of what, communism and socialism and capitalism and so on really are in practice. Now, there's another way to teach this. There's another way to teach this to children. There's another way to teach this to high schoolers and university students that doesn't rely on that kind of abstract reasoning. You can invite people to instead think about these things in a managerial, pragmatic, hands-on, problem-solving way. Well, we're not asking the question, who do you want to be? Do you want to be a good person or a bad person? And then we manage to associate being a good person with being a socialist or something. We say, you know what? Look, I used to live in a poverty-stricken third world country called Laos. At that time, there were several initiatives ongoing to build infrastructure for the internet. So people could use cellular phones, modern telephony, connect to the internet, and it changed the whole world. It changed people's lives. Okay, I remember one of the single greatest impacts was that farmers in remote villages were just able to find out how much money their crops were worth if, when they loaded it onto their cart, sometimes a cart pulled by a donkey, sometimes a cart with a pathetic little engine, won't get into it, but when they loaded their crops onto their cart, many of them had to ask the question, am I going to roll this cart to the east or am I going to roll it to the west? And if I sell it over there right now, the price is high. And if I sell it over there right now, the price is low. They might have 4 different places they can get to sell their rice or sell their mangoes, whatever it is they're harvesting. That's what they really need to know. And in the past, they didn't know, or they didn't know until it was too late. They didn't know until they'd rolled their cart several miles in the wrong direction that they should have been going somewhere else, right? Really basic fundamentals. And of course, while I was there, you saw the internet opening people's eyes because they'd grown up in a country where the only newspaper was published and controlled by the Communist Party. And now suddenly they can get every newspaper from everywhere in the world. They can know anything they want to know. They can answer any question they want to know, right? I remember actually being inside a Communist Party office, and at that time they'd launched the first version of Google Earth. So people have forgotten that. There was Google Maps, and they spun off this separate app that at that time you had to download and run off your hard drive of your computer. It was called Google Earth. And it wasn't that different from Google Maps, but it would give you this 3D model of the whole planet, the whole world. There it was, rotating on your screen, and you can click and drag around. And, that was still a country mired in such third world ignorance. They had really, I could tell a million stories about this, but, I met people who really believed that the map of the world was like Pac-Man. It was like the video game Pac-Man, where it was like a square map, but if you went off the bottom, you came back on the top. And they actually thought the reason why there were white people in Australia was that if you went south from Australia, you'd be in Europe. Like if you went south or east off the map from Australia and New Zealand, boop, you're back in Europe. Like that's how they thought the world worked. And they, I was trying to explain, no. This actually, there was colonialism and genocide. There's a whole different, So, the arrival of the internet here, it's true of every third world country, but especially a post-war, post-communist third world country. It makes a huge difference in people's lives. It's going to make a huge difference in the future of the country. Okay, how are you going to do it? How are you going to build the cell phone towers? How are you going to install the electrical lines, the lines that carry the data, so on and so forth? There is one school of thought that will say passionately, the government should do nothing at all. The government should just sit back, lower taxes, and let the private sector do its thing. Just leave it up to them. And the free market will innovate, and companies will come in and bid and tender, and it'll get done. Okay, it'll get done when? 5 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. Oh, and it'll get done where? Right? One of the contrasts between the National Postal Service, which is socialist, and private courier companies is that private courier companies only thrive in places like Los Angeles, Manhattan Island, where there's a lot of business and a lot of money to be made. Who's going to take the mail out to Alaska, out to remote areas where it's unprofitable? Okay, so yeah, maybe some private companies come in just to provide internet services and cell phone services in the densest part of the capital city. Who's going to take this out to the farmers in remote areas, right? So there's another school of thought that says, no, the only way to get this done and the only way to get it done today is for the government to declare a monopoly, to create a socialist service, call it the National Telecoms Administration, and start building the capacity, start installing what you need so that everyone can get the internet. And that'll be everyone. That won't just be the urban center. It'll be the rural periphery, not just the places where it's profitable. Just like the same way the National Highways Department builds roads that are never going to make any money, that go to remote areas just because politically or ethically it matters to provide roads to those people. In the same way, you're just going to provide internet connections to the most remote, the most poverty-stricken people. You're going to do it with taxpayers' money. And let's take it all the way to the extreme. So I was talking about creating a government agency to do this. If you want it done today, if you want it done immediately, it could be the military. You can get the military corps of engineers. Those could be the guys you hire or whatever. It's okay, we already got these guys who work for the army. They know how to make bridges. They know how to make tunnels. They know how to make a bunker. They know how to do electronics for this stuff. Well, we're going to train them and we're going to have them set up cell phone towers and start building the infrastructure so people can get internet connectivity. All right? These are real world problems. Each of these solutions, right, from my perspective, is wrong in as much as you begin and conclude the inquiry in a dogmatic way. All right? If you begin with the dogmatic assumption or the dogmatic assertion that there's only one way to build the internet in a third world country and this is it, whether it's free market or government, it's all wrong. All right? Real life is full of contradictions. Solutions that work in Laos won't work in Cambodia. Solutions that work in Cambodia won't work in Canada. You have a good idea and a good government program, but there's maybe just one bad person in charge, and it's a disaster, right? I mean, the fact that morally I feel much more comfortable with a non-profit prison than a for-profit prison doesn't mean I'm blind to the fact that many, worldwide, a shockingly large percentage of purely socialist prison systems are awful. And individually, if you're looking at prison conditions, prison by prison, you start to ask yourself, why is the government so bad at running prisons? Maybe the government does such a terrible job at this that we should invite the private sector to get involved because this is terrible. Just feeding and clothing and housing people and giving them a decent quality of life in prison. Why does a socialist approach to that fail so often? Those are really meaningful questions when you live with it, especially when you've got skin in the game. There's a phrase that was in fashion about 10 years ago in politics. You don't hear it anymore. What about when you have your own skin in the game? What about if you're choosing a prison that you have to go to? If you're choosing the prison you're going to spend 10 years in, and you're looking prison by prison at which ones are well managed, and which ones are a disaster. What if you're choosing the university that your child is going to attend? Do you just assume that a government-administrated university is better than a private sector university or one that's owned by a charity? What about when you're the one who has to go to the hospital? Which hospitals are you looking at? Do you just start from the dogmatic assumption that a government, socialist, nonprofit hospital is superior than a private sector, for-profit hospital, right? When it's something of yours or your life that's being risked. Maybe you'll start inquiring into what works and what doesn't in a much more dynamic and incisive way. Right? Real life in practice is full of these kinds of contradictions. So there's undiscovered underlying principles that can't be generalized about on a chalkboard. There is a cost. There's an unseen, invisible cost to just employing the military to build your cell phone towers, right? And that is that you're not developing the private sector capacity for innovation. Now, private sector, there's nothing glorious or inspirational about it, right? What the military can do in Laos, or if they create a government, national telecom service, some of this socialist system, they can take an already existing technology from China, an already existing technology from Europe, or the United States, and they can build it in Laos. But that's not really what you want. That's a short-term, single stage of analysis type of solution, right? What you really want is to have a bunch of guys in a bunch of offices and a bunch of small companies competing with each other for what's going to happen next. You want people innovating about the new, what's on the leading edge of telecoms. What they don't have in China yet. What's just coming out in Silicon Valley. Even if they're still following, guys who are following that news and who are figuring out, oh, how can my company make a little bit of extra money out of implementing this? How can we do something new and better and different and more, right? How do you have those companies training the next generation of people to innovate in the telecom sector? When you look at things as just a single stage of analysis, which, sometimes that's all there is, okay? The people need a bridge, and you say, okay, the government is going to build a bridge. The opportunity cost isn't clear to you. You say, well, if the government builds this bridge, we're never going to have a bunch of private sector companies setting up ferries and making money out of running boats. But hey, it's worth it. We're going to build this one bridge, and then nothing's going to change for 50 years. Sometimes that single stage of analysis isn't that misleading, right? But there is actually cost. There are disadvantages to excluding the private sector, to having an absolute government monopoly on anything, including healthcare, all right? What is the best way now in 2021 to provide healthcare to the people of Cambodia, to the people of Canada, to the people of Scotland, right? It's actually not easy at all to come to the conclusion that what we need is a monolithic, nonprofit government monopoly, that will work well. There are plenty of horror stories. There are plenty of signs that there are plenty of reasons why none of those countries today, Canada, Scotland, Cambodia, there are really good reasons why actually they have this kind of complex, convoluted compromise between private sector, for-profit elements, government elements, socialist elements, and this weird world in between of this weird world in between of civil society charitable foundations that are neither entirely socialist nor entirely private sector, that are involved with some other reasons, some other mix of motives. Now, all right, first things last. What I started this video by saying is that I feel the most important problem is the way in which these beliefs become part of our personal identity. That we think of ourselves first and foremost as capitalist or as socialist or as conservative or as liberal, and we think this is who I am, therefore this is how the world has to be, or therefore this has to be the policy or the institution that's going to be optimal, that's going to work the best. And what that precludes precisely is a genuinely skeptical assessment of what works in practice. Now, we're also conditioned to think in terms of these very simplistic equations on a chalkboard. Like, well, do you want to have an unequal society with a few millionaires and huge numbers of poor people, or do you want everyone to live in equality and social harmony? Your pick. Two incredibly simplistic equations. Okay. What makes the telecom system work? What makes a good 21st century telecommunications infrastructure? The answer is never going to be that simple. It's never going to be some kind of chalkboard equation. Like, oh, well, don't you believe in equality? Don't you believe in social justice? Well, then you must believe that the government should declare a monopoly and should directly administer, directly handle the provision of the internet and telecoms infrastructure. Can't you read what's on the chalkboard? Do you really want to live in a world where there were these easy to vilify figures like Bill Gates, the owner of Microsoft, the owner of Amazon.com and so on, where there's this small number of millionaires and billionaires getting rich off the internet as opposed to socializing it and distributing it to everyone equally? One of the easiest services imaginable for the government to take over would be Amazon.com at this stage after they build it up. You could have the military take over those warehouses. You could have a completely non-profit socialist government bureaucracy take over the administration of Amazon as it exists today, right? And then it's harder to see what's going to be lost. It's harder to see the positive contribution that's made to your society by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, by these corporations. It's hard to see the role of innovation. That there's actually something profoundly different if you compare what government bureaucrats do, what even in running a prison, even in running a university campus, right? Compared to what the private sector can do, right? And then apart from all this, it's not just a question of what people can do, but of what they actually will do, right? Because again, you could say that something that's the best business in theory or in principle, it's something that's the best government bureaucracy in theory or in principle, very, very often they fail in practice. And looking at that and looking at the richness of all the contradictory details and say, oh, well, they tried to imitate the French system in Cambodia, and for some reason the French system of medical insurance just doesn't work in Cambodia. Let's look at why. Oh, they took this idea that seemed to work out okay in Scotland and it doesn't work so well in Canada. Our university system was created largely in imitation of the Scottish system. That's an example. That somehow something went right in one place, and it's going to be for reasons that can't be captured easily and can't be generalized about easily on that chalkboard, right? So in conclusion, I feel that I'm living in a world now where nobody's asking the most important question about socialism. The socialists know what they know by reading books written by and for socialists. And I mean, the selection of examples, it's so telling. It's so damning. Let me ask you, I have some viewers in the audience, who are socialists, and you guys probably have heard the same positive examples of socialism working very well, even though some of them might be incredibly obscure and incredibly remote, involve small numbers of people for a small amount of time. It's like, the anarchists always want to mention this commune that came about in southern Spain during the Spanish Civil War for 5 minutes, 3 months of anarchy in one town in southern Spain, and they want to immortalize it as this example. And the socialists can pick and choose, oh, well, there's this one kibbutz in Israel that works on socialist principles. That's okay. Myanmar has been on the news so much lately. Have you ever once heard Myanmar referred to as a socialist country? Have you ever once heard Myanmar referred to as a failed socialist country? What do you think about the prisons in Myanmar? What do you think about the hospitals and healthcare in Myanmar? If you make a map of Africa and fill in all the countries that either were socialist in the past or some still are now, okay, and you look at those countries and you ask yourself, how did healthcare work out there? How did the telecom sector work out there? How did any of these things happen under socialism? People live their lives with these carefully selected examples that favor, in some cases, a totally pro-socialist agenda, in some cases, of course, an anti-socialist agenda. And yeah, I do see a lot of this mind game being played. I have heard socialists insist that Venezuela is not an example of socialism. Venezuela, a disaster, still ongoing today. And then you hear the pro-capitalists insisting, no, yes, it is. This really matters. This really shows you what happens when socialists get into power. So on and so forth. So it goes around the map. What I see as the fundamental problem is that indeed the Marxists are reading Karl Marx. The socialists are reading socialist propaganda. People on YouTube are living within, categories of viewing that only reinforce their own delusions, and they become further and further unstuck from reality. there's a very subtle and very pervasive form of propaganda that I think for most of us begins in high school, just in learning about politics from those abstract principles up on the chalkboard. Because what are you being asked? You're being told, okay, so this is the theory, like inequality versus equality, capitalism versus social justice, or however it's posed to you, And then the question is, which one are you? The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? And that's the wrong question to ask. That's not the question at all, right? The question you've got to lead people through, even if it's just as a thought exercise, is, okay, what if you were the Prime Minister of Cambodia today? This is the healthcare system you've got. This is the telecommunication system you've got. This is the train system you've got. Okay? Do you think it's really a simple, straightforward solution? Do you think it's a simple decision to make to just say, nope, we don't want any private enterprise. We don't want any private companies involved in the trains. We're going to do that just with taxpayers' dollars, just on a socialist, bureaucratic. But no, we don't. Oh, all these Christian charities that are providing healthcare, these private corporations that are providing healthcare, we're just going to kick them out. We're going to have a 100% socialist, not-for-profit healthcare system in Cambodia. If you do that right now, people are going to die. You think that's a simple solution? Even if you just look at, what if you were in Cambodia right now? You have to choose which hospital you're going to go to. And you take a look at what the government is providing. And you take a look at what the private sector is providing. Laos was still a communist country when I lived there. And I remember being so astonished, being so freaked out, because you wouldn't just see that comparing private hospitals to the public communist, socialist hospitals. Look at the dental offices. Look at the eyeglasses shops. The optometrists, where they test your eyes inside the eyeglasses. And you look at that and you think, how is it possible socialism got this wrong? It's so easy. It's so easy to test someone's eyes and sell them a pair of eyeglasses. And here's this private sector shop doing it, and they do a great job. And 2 doors over, just up the same street, there's the official Soviet-style apparatchik government department of get your eyeglasses. And it's more expensive, and it's slower, and it's worse, and they're fundamentally incompetent in all the ways that the private sector eyeglass shop is competent, And there isn't one simple equation on a chalkboard, to explain any of it. My concern ultimately is about people taking on socialism as a personal identity and then viewing the world in this way dogmatically while being completely aware of the depth of their own dogmatism.